Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur Class.
A lot of people have asked me about, and a lot of people ask about letzion. Why is it so long? Why is it here? Why is there a Kedusha? Why is there Aramaic? So we'll try to address all those questions. I think the one I can't address is why is it so long? The answer to why is it so long is because it is. Okay. So letzion is generally referred to in traditional sources as Kedusha de Sidra, the Kedusha of the Seder. And the Seder, usually it's called this in the Talmud. Actually, the phrase is used in the Talmud, and most commentators interpret this phrase to mean letzion, Kedusha de Sidra. And the Seder usually meant a teaching, okay, usually a teaching from the Bible. And that maybe gives us a little hint, that gives some scholars the hint into what the original setting or purpose of letzion was, the Kedusha de Sidra. So Kedusha de Sidra means letzion. That's the name of the paragraph if you look at certain Siddurim.
Avi, excuse me,
yes?
What page is it on in the Slim? What page in the...
80.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for asking. And letzion is entirely composed of verses from the Bible. Okay, so none of it is in original composition, post-biblical, except, of course, for the Aramaic, which is from the Aramaic Targum, or traditional Aramaic translations of the Bible. In other words, letzion is of a type of prayer of some of our earliest prayers, like the long section right after Baruch She'amar, and Yehi Chavod Hashem Le'olam, and much of the Slichot prayers of the high holidays, which is to say it is a new composition, I'm putting it in air quotes, which is comprised entirely of verses from the Bible that are taken from different places and put together. Okay, so rather than someone sat down to compose, someone sat down to compose an original prayer. I might sneeze again. Maybe I have to do a COVID test this morning. A rapid test. Rather than someone sat down to compose an original prayer, which is what it looks like if you look in our Siddur. You have this whole block of text, so it looks like someone sat down to write a block of text. In fact, what someone did is they cobbled together psukim from various places in the Bible as a way of composing a new text. So when someone does that, we have to ask, of course, why these psukim? And taking these psukim, we assume someone didn't do it. Obviously, someone didn't do it randomly. Someone did it thoughtfully. So the question is, why these psukim? And when they're taken out of context from all their various places and put together and juxtaposed, what kind of thrust or meaning or sense does this new composition have? Okay? Just to short circuit and go to the end at the beginning. Most people who read this paragraph or who talk about it in all the commentaries say that it's basically about two things. It's hope for the messianic future, and it's about Torah study. And the fact that it's about those two themes seems to imply some linkage, i.e., if we do Torah study, then we help bring the messianic future. That's an inference, okay? But most of it is about hoping for the messianic future, predictions of the messianic future, and about Torah study. So why would such a prayer be here? So there are various theories about letzion. One is always the favorite theory, which most academic scholars dismiss, which is the persecution theory. There was a persecution, and Jews were forbidden to say the Kedusha, and so the censors knew when to come to shul to make sure the Jews didn't say the Kedusha, proclaiming God's kingship, and then the censors left, and then we snuck in a Kedusha at the end. That's one explanation that's given in the traditional sources. Another one, which is probably has more accuracy in it, is that at this point, there was a teaching. There was a little Dvar Torah before people went home. And the Dvar Torah usually involved some teaching from the prophets, okay? And people were sent home on an uplifting note. If you keep studying Torah, the Mashiach is more likely to come sooner. And that's why this is here at the end of services. Now, originally, it might not have been at the end of services. Originally, the prayer might have been said at the end of a study session, disconnected from services. So, for example, the Talmud in, if you want to go look it up later, Tractate Sota 49a says, the world is sustained by two things. It's one of these hyperbolic Talmudic statements about what sustains the world. The world is sustained by two things. On the saying of Yehei Shmei Rabbah of the Agada, the Agadic teaching, and the Kedusha Desidra. Okay, so it's these two things, Yehei Shmei Rabbah and the Kedusha Desidra, interesting, both of them things that maybe have Aramaic, okay, are the two things, most important things, they sustain the world. And it's the Yehei Shmei Rabbah de Agadita, it says, of the Agada, which suggests that what the Talmud is talking about in Tractate 49a is that these were two passages that were said after a teaching, a public teaching. So there'd be a public teaching, and then one would say Kaddish, right? Just like, what's our version of that? Kaddish after teaching.
Kaddish Rabbanan.
Kaddish Rabbanan. So they're talking about Kaddish Rabbanan, and there would be a Kedusha that would be said after the Seder. So maybe these were actually originally in Talmudic times about a teaching session that was disconnected from the davening. Maybe eventually that teaching migrated into the davening, and after the teaching, this prayer was said. Many scholars say that is why there's Aramaic translation of the Kedusha, because the teaching, this is in late antiquity, Talmudic times, the teaching was given in the language that people could understand, that is to say Aramaic, not Hebrew. It was in their day-to-day language. And so it concluded with a prayer, right? The Kedusha in their day-to-day language, and or the Kedusha was recited, but it was translated into their everyday language so that they understood it, which of course raises interesting questions for us, given that if that was the original purpose, given that Aramaic is not our day-to-day language and English is our day-to-day language. You might want to raise a question of like, oh, well, then should we be saying those Aramaic passages in English if that was the original point? But I'm not going to go into that. There's another theory. So maybe there was, so one theory is there was a teaching session, a little vort, a Dvar Torah, at the end of davening every morning, which very often was an opportunity to teach from the prophets. And the idea of teaching eventually dropped out. Actually, a lot of the medieval sources say, and over time, because people became poor and they had to go rush off to work, there is no longer any teaching. This was omitted, but what was left was just these few opening verses from the prophets, which the two opening verses are from the Nevi'im, from Yeshayahu. We'll talk about the content of those verses in a moment. Okay? One more theory about why Kedusha Desidra is here is that there were latecomers who came to shul near the end and missed the Kedusha, and this was an opportunity for them to hear the Kedusha, because the Kedusha was important. By the way, there's another minhag that we tend not to practice at Beth Am, but you will see in a lot of traditional shuls for latecomers. And anyone know what that minhag is? You add one thing near the end of the service.
Baruch Hu.
Baruch Hu, either right before the Amida, or right before Aleinu, or right after Aleinu. So that is for someone who came to shul late, missed the Baruch Hu, is now in a minyan, and so they lead Baruch Hu, and then they go on with their davening. Right? We tend not to do that in Beth Am. And it's not actually printed in the conservative Siddur. It is printed in lots of traditional Siddurim. Right before or after, it's usually before Aleinu, sometimes after Aleinu. So we have three theories: persecution, latecomers, or there was a little Dvar Torah here, and this was the thing, the peroration after the Dvar Torah. Those are the three reasons that are usually given to why letzion exists and why it exists in this location. Okay? That's kind of the big picture. Why is it here? And kind of what the theme is. Now we're going to go through it. Again, if you said to me, but then why is it so long? That I don't have an answer to. And of course, a lot of us are deterred by its length. Okay. So we start out with two verses from Isaiah. Yes, Michael.
In respect to the comment that shouldn't we perhaps do it in English, the part that's in Aramaic, is Mickey's belief that since nobody speaks Aramaic now, he omits that. When he's leading davening, he just blows right through it.
Well, the chazan, meaning when he's privately davening.
No, I mean when he's leading.
Right. So the halacha is the chazan is not supposed to say any of the Aramaic aloud. Anyway, the traditional halacha, meaning you prompt the kahal by saying, V'karazel zevi amar. Everyone says kadosh, kadosh, kadosh aloud. You prompt the kahal by saying, you're a little bit ahead of us here, because people are going to say to me, where are you? So I think I want to say it when we get up to it.
Okay.
So we start out with two verses from Isaiah. First one is a short one. Uva letzion goel u'shavei pesha b'Yaakov ne'um Adonai. Zion will have a redeemer, says God. A clearly understood to be messianic. Vani zot briti otam amar Adonai. Ruchi asher alecha udvarai asher samti b'ficha. Lo yamushu mipicha u'mipi zaracha u'mipi zaracha. Amar Adonai me'ata ve'ad olam. This is so the first verse is short, second verse is really long. By the way, these are not consecutive verses. I believe they're not consecutive verses in Yeshayahu, Isaiah. So the second verse says, my brit with them, God saying, my brit with them, and my covenant with them, and the word that I have put in your mouth will not leave the mouth of you or your children or your children's children forever. So that is obviously understood in context here, not necessarily what it is in Isaiah, okay, but in context here to be about Torah, right? What is the teaching? That should always be in your mouth and your children's mouth, and your children's mouth, obviously, is the Torah, right? Even though it is not, the word Torah is not used. We have the word, what are the three things that are seen as the, I wouldn't say they're synonyms, but they're a set of three. Briti, Ruchi, and Dvarai. My covenant, my spirit, and my words. And then the words gets a long thing, right? Never leave your mouth forever. So God is saying, my covenant with you, my covenant with you, my spirit, which is on you, and my words, which are in the mouths of you, your children, and your children's children, the words which are in your mouths will never leave the mouths of will never leave your mouth and the mouth of your children and the mouth of your children's children. Okay? So we have Brit, Ruach, and Dvarim, covenant, spirit, and words, and then the thing that's sort of amplified on is the word. So this is understood to be a verse about Torah, and it's me'ata ve'ad olam, forever, right? So we start out saying the Mashiach is going to come eventually, and you will be studying Torah forever, which of course could either imply you should study Torah forever to help Mashiach come, or Mashiach is going to come and people will continue studying Torah forever even though the Mashiach has already arrived. Could be understood either way. Everyone with me? So that's the preamble to the Kedusha. And again, some of the scholars who say originally there was a teaching here and the teaching was from the prophets. Okay, by the way, there's no book that proves that. That's just a hypothesis. Then those scholars say, and these two verses of Isaiah are the only two verses that are left from their teaching. The lesson was shortened down to just two verses. Okay? So originally there was a Dvar Torah, which might have been something from the prophets, which ended with something uplifting. So go out and study Torah so the Mashiach will come. That was all abridged down to only two verses. Okay? Then we have the Kedusha itself. You might say that this next, the middle section of page 80, which the Slim Shalom sets it off nicely because it sets it into a different paragraph. It makes the whole Kedusha be a different paragraph, which the complete Sim Shalom does not do. So the Slim Shalom, I think, did a nice idea of identifying that this is a subsection of letzion. It is the Kedusha. So if the whole paragraph is called Kedusha de Sidra, all of letzion is called that. It is called that on the basis of this chunk in the middle, which is the actually Kedusha of the Sidra, right? It's the actual Kedusha of the teaching. So we have a little intro. You never go right into the Kedusha. A little intro. Ve'ata kadosh yoshev kilot Yisrael. You, O Holy One, are enthroned on the praises of Israel, right? We're now about to do that enthroning by doing the praises. Who are we imitating when we do that?
The angels.
The angels, right? So the angels enthrone God on high with the words of the Kedusha. We know that from Isaiah's line, Kadosh, 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 and Yechezkel, Ezekiel's line, Baruch Kvad Hashem Imkomo. Okay? And so we're just sort of saying you're enthroned, by implication here, not on the praises of the angels, but we imitate the angels. We're going to do your praise now. Okay? Quote from Isaiah. V'karaz el zev yamar, kadosh, 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 Adonai tzot, meloch kol haaretz kvodo. Close quote. And we talked about the Kedusha in the Amidah, so I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of these verses, okay? Because we talked about it twice. Once when we had the Kedusha de Miyushav, the seated Kedusha, part of the first blessing right after Baruch Hu. And then we have a Kedusha the second time, Kedusha da Amidah, the Kedusha we say standing as part of the Amidah, and this is the third Kedusha. So I don't think I'm going to go over the content of the lines much unless you have questions about it. So then we have the Aramaic Targum. So in late antiquity for hundreds of years, Jews spoke Aramaic as their primary language. The Bible was translated into Aramaic. There were a number of different translations in Aramaic. We have received certain ones that have come to be deemed as the authoritative, but they were not the only ones, just as there are a variety of translations of the Bible into English. And there was probably a period in which when the Torah was read publicly, laning, that a translator would repeat every line in Aramaic after the Torah reader read it in Hebrew. Some Yemenite congregations still do that today. Young Israel of Beverly Hills, which is not in Beverly Hills, but is on Pico Boulevard, has a minyan in the back of the building. It's not their main minyan. It's the backroom minyan, which is an Orthodox Yemenite minyan where they still lane this way. The Gabbai chants each verse in Aramaic after the Torah reader reads each verse, which makes laning on Shabbat morning very long. Okay? But this is a traditional way in which the Torah was read maybe 1,500 years ago, and some Yemenite congregations still do it. As far as I know, the Yemenites are the only ones who do it. I don't think other Mizrahi traditions do it, as far as I know. So if you owned like a Mikra Ot Gedolot, a Tanakh with traditional commentaries, and you looked at what's the Targum of Isaiah, Kadosh, 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 this is what it is. Okay? We're going to notice now, it is not a literal translation, but rather an amplification. Umekablin dein midein v'amrin, which means v'kara ze el ze ve'amar. That's pretty close. But Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh is then exploded out to be what, right? Didn't you always wonder, why do the angels say it 3 times? So here's the answer according to the Targum. The first Kadosh is Kadish Bishmei Roma Ila'a Beit Shchinte. It means God is sanctified up in the highest heavens. And the second Kadosh means Kadish al Ara Ovad Givurte. God is holy on the earth, which is the creation of his mightiness. Something like that. Kadish la'alam al me'al maya. He is holy. God is Kadosh forever. Hashem Tzvaot. Then we have Hashem Tzvaot, untranslated. Notice, right? Malya kol aretz ziv yikareh. The whole world is filled with the shininess of his kavod. Yikar is the common Aramaic translation of kavod. So we know, I'll just say this briefly, of the different translations into Aramaic. Some of them are very literal, and some of them make changes and have interpolations. So the standard Targum for the Chumash, which is called Targum Onkelos, is known as the most literal. It's not 100% literal. There's times when it euphemizes because it tries to avoid anthropomorphisms about God. So it tries not to translate God's mighty right arm in a literal way. Okay? But in general, Targum Onkelos is the most literal. But we know there are and there is no Targum Onkelos. There's Targum Onkelos only on the Chumash, only on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, not on Nevi'im or Ketuvim. There's no Onkelos on Nevi'im and Ketuvim. It's a different Targum. It's Targum Yonatan or Targum Yerushalmi, right? And the other Targumim, other than Targum Onkelos, another way of saying it is, it's as if I said to you, and you'd say, duh, right? If I said to you, different English translations have a different editorial purpose. Some English translations want to translate literally. Some English translations want to translate idiomatically. Some English translations want to translate incorporating certain ideology. So, for example, I have a Chabad Chumash with Chabad English translation, right? Or if you look at the Stone Chumash, which is the Art Scroll Chumash, which has an English translation, they will incorporate traditional Orthodox ideology into the translation, okay, which, let's say, the JPS does not, okay? And then you have the JPS Chumash, which tries to translate more or less literally, and then you have a couple of others like Everett Fox or Robert Alter, Everett Fox in particular, who want to translate, not into, they have their own purpose, idiomatic English that replicates the sound of the Hebrew, right? So different translations can have a different purpose behind them, all right? Targum Yonatan is known as a non-literal translation. So the standard Aramaic translation of Isaiah was written by someone who does not give a slavish literal word-for-word translation. He sometimes has interpretations. He will sometimes interpolate all kinds of Agadic material, Midrashic material, And here what Targum Yonatan has done is he has given you an explanation of why does it say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Do you want me to go to a different room? Okay. Why are there three Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadoshes? It is not repetitive. Rather, what it means is God is sanctified in heavens, God is sanctified on earth, and God is sanctified forever and ever. In other words, the three Kadoshes are not just repetitive. They are rather meant to convey that God is sanctified everywhere and for all time, right? Above and below and forever. So we have a spatial dimension and a temporal dimension. So Targum Yonatan, this Aramaic translation of Isaiah, which is copied into our Siddur, has an interpretation which he didn't necessarily make up, right? So if you want to know if Targum Yonatan made that up or not, you'd have to, you'd look at various midrashic commentaries on Kadosh, 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 in the scene in Isaiah's vision of God sitting on the throne and the angel saying Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. You'd want to look at the various midrashic commentaries on Kadosh, 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 which I haven't done. And you'd want to see, is Targum Yonatan creating something new, or is Targum Yonatan simply incorporating the midrashic interpretation of Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh? I suspect it's the latter, but I can't tell you I've researched that. Okay? So Targum Yonatan expands on Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Larry, I think you have a hand up.
I was just going to make a comment. You talked about, in particular, the stone Chumash translations. I don't know if you want to just comment on the translation of Shir Shirim, which is the most extreme example of a commentary in lieu of a translation at all.
Right. Or, well, again, I don't want to say it's a commentary in lieu of a translation. I want to say all commentaries have an ideology, an editorial ideology behind them. Their editorial ideology is the correct way to understand any passage in the Bible is the way that Haredi Judaism has decided is a particular line of interpretation. So this strikes us modern people as sort of silly when we read, where in Hebrew it says your two breasts, and in English it says Moses and Aaron, right? But yeah, I just want to point out, Art Scroll didn't make that up. That's what the traditional medieval commentators say. So they would simply say a correct way to understand the Hebrew is with the guidance of our sages of blessed memory. That's their ideology. Is that a reasonable response?
Only to say, understood, and I'm not complaining about it. The first time, if you ever, for example, just for instance, innocently picked up that Chumash because you wanted to read Shir Shirim, you might say, wait a second, this is a misprint. Something's wrong.
That might be, if you had that view, or if you had a different view, you might react by saying, thank God that the editors of Art Scroll have given us a correct understanding of what Shir Shirim means. So it depends on your ideology.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but I will say there is a certain amount of distance from the accepted literal translation of the words, even if it's not the correct interpretation, where you get so far that most people would say, wait a second, something's going on here. That's all I'm saying.
I got it. And what I'm saying, Larry, is they didn't invent that. That was invented in the year 1000 or before. They are simply transmitting what many of the traditional commentators say. So they're saying what we have to learn, correct understanding of Torah is what our sagacious, sagacious, I guess, sage, but sagacious. Hey, Alan?
No, I was just saying sagacious.
Sagacious, because it's not an I or an E. Correct. Right. So the correct understanding is what our sagacious sages have interpreted for us for over 1,000 years, right?
Understood and accepted.
I got it. So all I'm saying is like, oh, if you read Rashi first and a lot of other commentators, and then you read Art Scroll, then you'd say, oh yeah, okay, they're faithfully transmitting what the sages. Now, not all interpreters say that, but there's very strong line of medieval interpretation of Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, that it's allegorical. And you can say it's because they were uncomfortable with the literal sexuality or whatever. But Art Scroll didn't invent it. That's all I'm saying. They are standing on the shoulders of people who are standing on the shoulders of people who came before them. Okay, let's just finish the Kedusha part. Okay, today. Vatisaeni ruach v'ashmacha rai kol ra'ash gadol. That is the intro line from Ezekiel, right? Baruch kvod Hashem imkomo. That's Ezekiel. And then we have the Targum to Ezekiel. Unatalatni rucha v'shimet batrai kol zia sagi dimeshabchin ve'amrim. That's added, which praises and says, right? Brich yikarad Adonai me'atar beit shchinte. So that's a pretty close to a literal translation there. So that Targum is not majorly. It's not as different from the original Hebrew as the Kadosh, Kaddish is. Then we have a third verse, and the third verse of Kedusha is always interesting because the third verse of Kedusha, when there is a third verse, is not from a mystical vision, because there are only two mystical visions in the Kedusha, the core Kedusha, right? Isaiah, Kadosh, and Ezekiel, Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkomo, which is why when we do our first Kedusha, seated, right, before the Shema, after Baruch Hu, before the Shema, it's part of Yotzer, we only have those two verses, okay? The third verse, and by the way, the third verse is added in the Kedusha of our Amida, which is Yimloch, right? Yimloch Hashem Haluya is from the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms has no Aramaic Targum. It has no accepted traditional Aramaic Targum. I don't know if there ever was one. That I have no idea. And so a different third, because we want the people to understand the Kedusha, and they only understand Aramaic in the year 500 of the Common Era or whenever, and there is no Aramaic for Yimloch Adonai Le'olam Elohai Tzion L'dor V'dor Haluya, because it's from the Psalms, and there is no Aramaic translation of the Psalms. Therefore, a different verse of Melucha, God's kingship, is picked here. Probably that's the reason. Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed, where does that come from? Anyone remember? We say it every morning as part of the davening. You take it for granted because it's so small and obvious. So obvious that it's hard to think of it. Shirat Hayam, Song at the Sea.
At the very end, yes.
Exodus, right? So,
very end.
So instead of Yimloch Adonai Le'olam Elohai Tzon L'dor V'dor Haluya, which we have in the standing Kedusha, which is about God's kingship. So what's the idea? Oh, the angels enthroned you by saying their line. So we want to say a line enthroning you. Yimloch Adonai Le'olam Elohai Tzon L'dor V'dor Haluya. It's about God's kingship, rulership. Okay, in this Kedusha, which I want to have a translation in Aramaic, I'm going to pick a different kingship line. Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. Okay? By the way, and we know from Kedusha on Shabbat morning, Shacharit, and Shabbat morning, Musaf, and the three pilgrimage festivals, Shalosh Regalim, that there were other lines that were sometimes added in the Kedusha, right? So the core Kedusha, or imitating the angels, sanctifying God's name, is two lines, Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkomo from Isaiah, from Ezekiel. Our Shachrit Amida on the weekday adds one line. Musaf on Shabbat adds other lines. It adds the Shema, right? Festivals adds Adir Adirenu, right? So we recognize that there was a ritual practice, let's just say, of in certain Kedushas, other lines were added other than the core Kedusha. Okay. In our Amida, we add one line about God's kingship. And in this Kedusha de Siddur, we substitute a different line about God's kingship And that's because this line does have a Targum or an Aramaic translation, whereas Psalms does not have any Aramaic translation. And so if the purpose was so that everyone would understand the Kedusha by translating into Aramaic, we have to have a different line. Okay? I'll conclude with one word on this, which is that in general, the halacha says, in general, there's other opinions, but the majority of halachic opinion is that none of the Aramaic translation is said aloud by the Chazan. By the way, there's another opinion I came across, which is that when you're davening individually, you're not supposed to say the Kedusha because you only say the Kedusha with a minyan, right? So there is a halachic opinion. This is not, I think it's not the majority opinion, that when you're davening individually, you say the Hebrew lines silently and the Aramaic lines aloud. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that's the majority opinion, but there is a halachic opinion that says that. But the majority of halachic opinion is that the Chazan does not say any of the Aramaic aloud. In other words, the Chazan says, V'kara v'ata kadosh yoshev tilo Yisrael v'kara zel zev yamar kadosh kadosh. And then the Chazan says, V'tisayini ruach v'ashma acharai kol ra'ash gadol. Everyone joins in, Baruch kavod Hashem mimikomo. And then the Chazan does not say, Brichi karat Hashem me'atar beit shchinte, which, by the way, is not a prompt. Notice the other two are the prompt. They're the lead-in of the Kedusha line from Isaiah, right, and from Ezekiel. But Brichi karat Hashem me'atar beit shchinte is not a prompt to Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed. It's just the last part of the Aramaic translation of line number 2. So it doesn't even, regardless of whether you knew the halacha of saying Aramaic aloud or not, it doesn't actually make any sense to use it as a prompt, right? So there are some, depending on where you daven, in some shuls, some traditions, the Chazan does not say Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed aloud at all. Everyone's just davening it. And in some shuls, the Chazan says Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed aloud, right? But halachically, the Chazan is not supposed to say the Aramaic words before it as a prompt. In other words, Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed has no intro. The other two Kedusha lines have an intro, and Chazan prompts us by saying that intro line, and the third line has no intro. So either the Chazan says Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed, or the Chazan says nothing, and it's all said individually and silently. But as far as I know, I'm not a posek, not a halachic decisor. As far as I know, for the Chazan to say Brichi karad Hashem me'atar beit shchinte as a prompt is incorrect. One could understand why a Chazan would feel they should do that, right? The first two lines have an intro, so how do you know when to join together for Hashem yimloch le'olam va'ed? There should be an intro. So on some human level, I understand why that is. I think it's halachically incorrect as far as I know. Again, you'd have to ask Rabbi Kligfeld. He is the decisor for our shul. Okay, we're running over. I'm going to stop. If there are questions, please hold on to those questions for next time, where we'll continue through the collection of verses of Uva Letzion, and we'll try to see if in fact the claim that I made at the beginning, that it's about the Mashiach and Torah study, if in fact that hangs together when we look at the verses.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.